Go.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Topical Talks with Theo and Andy.
Morning.
So, how's the week been then for you?
Very, very good. Very interesting to see stuff going on in the news.
There's been a lot happening, isn't there?
There's been a lot happening, and all sorts of different threads, which gives you lots of food for thought.
It's an interesting one, actually, because I was thinking about our podcast last week, and because we always, it's the way we take feedback, and this is before we actually start what we're going to talk about, and we had some feedback of someone about how we, about our performance, and because we don't always see it because we're on the other side of it. And one of the things here, the phrase, it's really an opportunity to use to actually as a gap filler while you're thinking of what you are going to say. And the other thing is we used to interrupt each other an awful lot, and today we are not we actually last week we didn't interrupt each other that much, did we?
Not so much, because we did take on some feedback.
Okay, because the thing is, feedback, as someone said to me, feedback is the breakfast of champions. It's interesting because David Copperfield, the magician, he hasn't been around for a few years, or I actually haven't been aware of him for a few years, but he was one of those great magicians of his time, of his era. And all he actually ever wanted to do was receive negative feedback on how he keep on improving his performance and keep on improving his performance. Ultimately, he became one of the best magicians of his era. I don't know whether he still is or not. I don't really pay much attention to him. But the question we have today, do you want to share it, or should I?
You're one doing talking.
So the question today, the killer question today is: are we in control of our own lives, or are we victims of the marketplace?
Victims of the marketplace, which sucks us dry in every way possible. For instance, financially, our health, our sanity, all gets sucked like ether into the air and into the coffers of these multinational giants.
Well, you're almost sounding socialistic there, Theo.
I am, aren't I?
Yes, you are.
But that's why that's what gives these some rather extreme organisations credibility.
Have you been reading Trotsky by any chance? Anyway, so I wanted to. So the reason why we actually ask this is because we are the marketplace conditions us very, and I think we're all apparent of that. But we don't actually think that we are. We go through the whole system where we go through the school system, and we are taught by the school system, you've got to get good grades, because if you get good grades, you have to get good grades so you can go to university. So we go into we work. Some of us work hard, and we go towards university. And they say, well, you've got to you've got to do well at university so you can get a good job, and then you get a good job, and then once you've got the job, you then go into the marketplace, and the marketplace then taxes you and dictates how you live by the money it gives you, and ultimately that's where it goes. And along the way, we've now picked up an enormous amount of debt, like university fees and our living expenses, so we can actually get that job. Now, I did read an article the other day in the BBC website, because obviously they're a very honest source of information, aren't they? And they actually, they did actually say is that if you actually are a university graduate, you'll earn 250,000 more in a lifetime. And we're talking about the average here. We're not talking about the exceptions.
I think that's based on out-of-date information now, though, isn't it?
I think it's all outdated information. Now, don't get me wrong. I put my daughter through private school. I wanted her to get a different education because I didn't want her coasting through the state educational system. So I put her through private school. I wanted her to do well, and I wanted her to go to university and all those things. But that is all my past conditioning leading her to that, because right now one thing we're actually witnessing is that there is a lot of university graduates who are leaving university and are having to take jobs in McDonald's and Starbucks, which is many years ago that wouldn't have been the case, because they now can't get jobs in the marketplace because of the way technology is, which means they are, and automation is now replacing people. And globalization means it's more competitive. Now, you can see that as a negative way, ultimately, you could also see it in a very positive way, because the more competition there is, it means more people have to raise their standards. So the people who are actually working in the McDonald's and the Starbucks means they have to raise their standards a little bit more. Again, that is being manipulated by the marketplace. But it does create growth. So what we wanted to really cover today, and we were having a little chat about it earlier, is the conditioning of what we have of how the market asks us to behave and how we tend to follow suit, whether it's politics or whether it's by the pharmaceutical industries. I know you love that one. I'm sure you've got shares in the pharmaceutical industry. But we were talking about it because I've been on this eating plan. I'll say eating plan. I've been doing what's called intermittent fasting, where I've been fasting for 22 hours a day and I eat over a 2-hour period. And I have lost weight, and you did comment this morning. And my sleeping patterns have got better and all this. So, but I had done a lot of research on that to see whether it would suit me. And one thing I did notice was, or there were comments by people that, someone gave a TED talk, and they were talking about that the food industry, they want us to eat more because there's big money there. Now, I'm surviving perfectly well on this one meal a day, even though I have lost weight, which is good for me. But does the marketplace want us to be overweight, Theo? Do you think?
Of course it does. And I think that is exactly the trouble, that unless we're spending money on stuff, then our current economy will simply collapse. And therefore, because there's always innovation and something new, then we constantly have to be spending more and more and more money, which is why we get into more and more debt. So whatever you're doing, whether it's an iPhone and going for the latest iPhone, I mean, Apple would go bankrupt immediately if they produced one phone that continued upgraded and lasted forever. And yet I'm sure they're quite capable of making one. Just like razor blades. Razor blades, it's quite technically possible to make a razor blade that never goes blunt. But of course, everyone would go bankrupt again.
You aren't going to go, really? Because you aren't going to go wear and tear, aren't you?
Apparently you can. Well, a diamond-tipped razor blade, that will not go blunt.
A diamond-tipped razor blade, you'd have to pay a lot of money for that diamond-tipped razor blade.
Not
actually saying
diamonds.
that, because actually it's interesting, because I've been writing my book at the moment. Do you want to finish up? I interrupted there, so I'll go back to you.
And I think
do you want to talk about the diamond tip?
It's exactly the conditioning. What one group of people will or what one generation will discover allows them to be successful. It's in their interests to keep that going. And therefore, of course, if you go to university, you get your high-paid job, but you're not going to leave that high-paid job.
Only some people get a high-paid job. Let's not face it. Not everyone goes to university.
We're talking about more in the past now.
Okay.
So before, you're right. Before in the past, a university degree was almost a passport to doing well economically in life. And now, of course, it isn't, and one of the reasons is because people in their high-paid jobs aren't going to leave it. And very interestingly, this is reflected in all aspects, all strata of society. So, for instance, they did a study on New York gangsters, and they found that the gangsters who rose up through the ranks in the 80s made phenomenal amounts of money, but now if you are a gang member, a New York gangster, it's a very, very poor career choice with a 7% chance of being shot in a year. And actually the foot soldiers make less than the minimum wage, but they do it because they're still conditioned into thinking this is the way to become hyper wealthy.
Well, the thing is, if you look at how advertising works, they ply us with subliminal marketing and things like this. And it's interesting that you talk about gang members, because I had a colleague of mine actually, and he actually explained to me why people join gangs and why gangs do work so well. And the reason is because it meets all the what Anthony Robbins talks about, the 6 human needs, which is really a variation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And ultimately, it meets the 6 human needs in terms of significance, because when you're in a gang, you feel significant. It means certainty, because you feel that your brothers or your sisters are protecting you, so you have certainty that you are part of this this group of people who have your back. You have variety, because let's face it, in some ways you can get shot, but ultimately there's a lot of variation in your life, a lot of uncertainty, as they say. they talk about love and connection. So when you're in a gang, you're part of this tribe, you actually feel very connected, and you can grow within the gang. You know, you get growth as a person. Even as you get older, your status may go from foot soldier to lieutenant or whatever it is, and contribution as well. So you do get contribution because you contribute back to the gang. So when it fulfills all those 6 human needs, you are talking about why that's why gangs actually work. And ultimately, people who know human behaviour know this. Marketers, you put marketing and human behaviour together, condition becomes very, very easy. And
well, you see, we covet what we want.
Okay.
We covet what we get to want. What we covet what we see. We get to want what we see. What we see becomes our conditioned desire most of the time.
Providing it's attractive, though.
If it's not attractive, then we get desensitized to it. So, for instance, because we hear about murder and destruction all the time, we get less shocked by it. Actually, even these horrible things that happen, we do get less shocked, on the whole.
It's interesting. We're shocked now, but you go back to medieval times, and even probably, about 200-300 years ago, it's not exactly shocking as to what's happening then as to what's happening now.
Well, that's right. It was indeed, studies have been done, and medieval times were far more violent than they were now. And for instance, now you have if you're on death row, you have a 2% chance of dying a year. Sorry, explain
that. You have a 2% chance of dying
a year. So if you're condemned to death and you're put on death row with all the appeals and so on that you have a right to, your chance of dying is 2%. So actually, your chance of dying as a New York gangster is much higher than if you're on death row.
Because not every thing is. We all assume diamonds are what we see in the marketplace as jewelry and things like this. What people don't realise with diamonds is that only about 20% of the diamonds that are actually found are suitable to make jewelry. The rest are become what's called industrial diamonds, and they're used because they're the hardest stone, so they can cut. So it doesn't actually have to be nice and shiny and sparkly. It just needs to be able to cut, and that's what it works. And it's interesting, and that's where Kodak, in some ways, went bust. By the way, you remember Kodak?
Mm-hmm.
You see, if you think about it, they made a lot of their money from selling photographic paper and selling films and things like this. As soon as the digital camera came along, that was their industry wiped out. And they didn't. And the thing is, they didn't adapt to the marketplace as well as some of the other manufacturers did, which is why they just went into total, Armageddon for them, really.
Yeah, they had a huge facility in Greenford, didn't they? And that's completely disappeared.
That's in West London for our overseas listeners, mm-hmm. because they know Greenford very well. So we were talking about, so ultimately we are conditioned by the marketplace. I mean, advertisers do it all the time. Do you remember that flake advert? There was a flake advert where you had this beautiful woman eating this chocolate flake, because obviously it's the healthiest food you can possibly eat, and she was, she had no % body fat. She was absolutely stunning, eating this flake, and that actually, and she became, actually, I think she became famous for that, and we were manipulating to that. And it's the same with Mars. Remember, a Mars a day helps you work, rest, and play. Really? Does it? So all this in terms of subliminal marketing.